Hello, beautiful micro philosophical community. Hmm. Health crap. What's possible? A gentle chat, little bit on the philosophy of food. You will believe, because you know the internets, that I get a lot of questions about food too. Now, I've got to be honest, most of them are about giving me advice. 4 days, 4 months on the carnivore diet, and blah, blah, blah. But some are questions. And three questions that I have fished out are: do crisps make us unhappy? Which is really the sort of thought, is this problem we have with our diet in Western culture something that's big civilizationally? Or is it not a big deal, and how do we deal with it as individuals? Second question is a question I get not every week, but probably every month, which is veganism morally required? And the third question is alcohol bad for us? Is alcohol morally bad for us? Now, in a coffee table conversation kind of way, we just want to spend 3 or 4 minutes on each with your permission. Throughout the history of the West, of course, philosophers have written about how we produce food, grow food, eat food, from Plato to Nietzsche. But I want to be much more modest today than talk about what general things we can say about the place of food in the flourishing human life. So we're just going to give very, very partial and inadequate answers to these three questions. So let's get going. Does eating crisps make you unhappy? And here you've got this image of perhaps yourself eating 2 packets of crisps, even though you've had enough meals during the day while waiting for the train, waiting for the bus, or in your car. And perhaps you're doing that every day. I think most of you are not, but perhaps some of you are. What's this all about, and how bad is it? So let me just put aside the complex biology here, which needs to be given more credit, as it were. In other words, we're overemphasizing in our self-help culture how much things are just choices, and underestimating how much people get into certain inflammatory cycles, for instance. So I'm actually very, very low on blaming an obese person for their predicament, and I'm very uncomfortable with the degree of blame that occurs in our culture. But aside from what can we say civilizationally, I think that it's worth reflecting on the dissolution of our concept of happiness into something that's a Disneyfied or childlike form. How many enticements into adulthood are absent in our thinking about happiness that should be there. And if we look at the ancient world, the ancient Greeks, we're going to find 2 remarkable differences between how they think of happiness and how we do. Some of them thought of happiness as not a psychological state at all, but really whether your life has gone well. So that if Ricky feels quite okay about his life, but his life is a disaster, he can't be said to be happy. Let's say Ricky thinks he's a great philosopher, but he's a crap philosopher. He spends 45 years working as a professional philosopher, and he thinks he's really great, but he's really crap. And so, on that view, he hasn't had a happy life, even though he feels good about it. Or certainly would say he feels good about it. Now, or he thinks he feels good about it. Or he thinks he feels good about it. Okay, enough. But the other thought is that all right, yes, happiness should be thought of as a psychological state, but it's one that's to be thought of across a life as a whole. And it's that in particular that I want to bring our attention to. Thinking of happiness in terms of a bow that goes from the beginning of life to the end. And in that perspective, there is a difference between a remarkable meal and a few packets of crisps, which I'll bring out in terms of a term I'm very, very fond of, and that term is digestiveness. And a word about digestiveness is really the second thing I want to say about this civilizational crisps crisis. For me, digestiveness is, and I'll do a separate video on it, is a concept, and this is my concept, I haven't seen it articulated. Digestiveness is a thick or rich concept for me because it contains both a factual element and an aesthetic element. So a food or a drink is digestively good if the next day you feel good about it, which isn't just a matter of physicality in the biological sense, but it's also a matter of physicality in this embodied aesthetic or even moral sense, right? And no meal's a great meal unless it feels physically and morally good for you to have it inside you, to having had it inside you 24 hours later. And that is the opposite of a packet of crisps that you can feel terrible about just after 90 seconds. So that's not remotely an answer to this question, but it's the beginning of one of the threads that are worth discussing. Second question, is it morally required to be vegan? Well, of course, we're talking about several conversations here. One is the climate crisis. What does it require ethically and politically? The other is physical health. And the third is animal welfare, care for animals, what some people would call animal rights. Let me say something about that third bit. And about the first two, I'll just make a couple of quick assertions. First bit, climate crisis. I think that I'm enormously more compelled by the argument that we should try to go mostly vegan than I am by the argument that we should go completely vegan. In fact, I reject that argument for climate reasons. So if you wanted to argue that we should go 90% vegan, I'm going to find that a much more compelling argument than the argument that we should go to 100% vegan. That does depend on some empirical assumptions about what the implications of different kinds of farming are. I have views about that. I won't bother you with them now, but obviously that implies contrasts between certain kinds of farming and the industrial calamity that we have going on now. On the health bit, all I want to say is that we, in our discourse, because we're so polarized, tend to underestimate how individual this is. And this gets more important when you're talking about chronically ill people, because for them, food is medicine. So you can't be, and I'm sorry to be tough about this, but you just can't be a strong advocate of a particular kind of diet and come at a person with multiple sclerosis who is in a high-fat, animal product paleo diet and say go vegan. Just like you can't come to a cancer patient who is vegan and say go paleo. I think, well, it's crazy. That's not the right diet for my disease or for my personal biology and its interaction with my disease. So food's medicine for disabled people, and this is a very individual story. So let's get to the ethics. Of course, this would require a 4-hour lecture, so I can only just touch on a few threads. One argument that is, if not wrong, woefully insufficient, that's a pro-vegan argument, is the argument that humans have something like a rationality or a moral conscience, and that therefore we can just, and should just, choose to be vegan. Well, that argument doesn't establish anything. all it establishes is that we do have something like a rationality and something like a moral conscience, but that's compatible with our being predators. Because it could just be that we're predators whose predation is refracted, filtered, inflected by our moral conscience and rationality expressed in different cultural circumstances, such that our rationality and our moral conscience transforms and makes culturally variable what kind of predators we are, rather than changing the fact that we're predators. A second argument that I think I reject in most senses except in one is this idea that to eat an animal you have to be able to physically take its life. You can't have your red snapper for dinner unless you're able to spear it with your hands and a spear. I don't buy that, roughly for the same reasons that I don't buy the argument that no politicians should start a war unless they're happy to put their children on the front line. Wonderful philosopher Bernard Williams once responded to that argument by saying that if that was your demand, you'd risk ending up with politicians who are terrifyingly ready to put all of us on the front line. So we actually don't want politicians who are immediately ready to put their children on the front line in a just war, because that's scary. But there is actually a way in which I am impressed by this vegan argument, even though the way I'm impressed by it goes in the very opposite direction to where the argument tries to go. And that's to say that I am actually personally compelled. I know many people are not, but I am personally compelled by the idea that what's on my plate, if it's not a vegan dish, is about life and death. But that doesn't put me off my food. That just makes my respect for my food greater and my relationship with my food more sacred. And the third remark I'd make is that I absolutely reject utilitarian arguments. And I will do something like a lecture on utilitarianism on this channel at some point. But if you present me 10,000 pigs versus a single human newborn baby and you ask me who do you want to save, my answer isn't going to be just that I'm going to save the baby. My answer specifically is going to be that I'm going to save the baby without thinking about it. In other words, there is already something that's gone wrong, in my view, if you sit there weighing up the capacity for suffering and the capacity for self-consciousness and self-awareness of various kinds that a particular animal has, that you're comparing to the human. I'm saving the baby because they're human. It's an expression of species belonging, not an expression of a utilitarian calculation of capacities for experience, positive and negative. And I say that as, to be Trumpian about it, somebody who loves pigs and knows pigs, and nobody loves pigs more than me. Nobody knows about pigs more than me. My knowledge about pigs is perfect, and my love for pigs is infinite. As an ex-pig owner, I'm being facetious, millions of people know more about pigs than me, but what I want to say is that I know pigs well. I know their capacity for being nice pets well, even though I'm a disgraceful ex-pig owner, because while my beautiful relationship with my pig Hillary was very beautiful, my baby pig Ruby is not a pig with whom I had a deep relationship, because Ruby ran away. Ruby was a boy, but he was very feminine, so he was called Ruby, but he ran away. Because I didn't proof the fence as well as I had hoped in the garden in Tonga. So I love pigs, and my pig thought I was its mum. And of course I didn't eat my pig. But even allowing for all of that, it's human for me, because of the understanding that you can't get to this conclusion by trying to get to it by utilitarian means. Next question. Is alcohol morally bad? I think I've got a couple of ethical remarks here. The first is that, roughly following Freud, I'm tempted to say that when we're tipsy, we're more us rather than less us. I'm going to leave it at that. 2, I do dismiss as psychopathological the idea that nobody should ever drink alcohol unless it comes as part of a rich theistic tradition to which you belong. So accept that if you say it as part of a theistic tradition. I reject it if it's just Ricky and Bobby who thought that up while being on a hippie retreat. And that's some kind of personalized spirituality that's got them there. Well, it could be okay for them, for their diet, but if they begin saying that nobody should eat meat, and that's disconnected from a major theistic tradition, I reject it as psychopathological. But then there is this conceptual point that's worth making. I think it's not an ethical point, but it's a conceptual point that a philosopher probably should make, even though it's really available to anybody. And that's that we still have certain kinds of limits to our understanding. I think the basis should be that alcohol is bad. Even the most beautiful wines are not physically good for you, except if you drink very little in moderation and you enjoy the communion with the wine, with yourself, with others. But let's take an example. Imagine we've got 200,000 German women aged 20 to 40. And imagine that a quarter of them drink 0 glasses of wine a day, quarter drink 1, quarter drink 3, and quarter drink 2, quarter drink 3. And we run a big study looking at rates of breast cancer. And we discover, and this is entirely hypothetical because I want to avoid even commenting on the medical science here directly, let alone giving any advice, let alone giving any health advice. So nothing I say is anything other than philosophical speculation. But imagine that we find that as they go from 0 glasses to 1, the health impact is quite low. It's not worrying and not so significant. But imagine if they go from glass 1 to glass 2 and then the health impact becomes significant. Now we know already what worries us here epistemically, and that is what else they're doing. Are they very stressed? Are they eating burgers and crisps? And are the people who do the 1 glass not eating burgers and crisps? We know about that problem, but there is another problem. What's the alcohol they're drinking? See, if they're drinking supermarket plonk, which if it doesn't have a label and did have a label, you'd see several ingredients in it that might freak you out, right? The industrial wine production has nothing to do with artisanal wine. It's a separate product, really. But imagine moving from that to a beautiful Malbec from Catena Zapata. It'll be a cleaner wine. But then imagine saying, well, that Malbec is itself not that clean. What if we move from there to a beautiful artisanal Burgundy? What's going to be the difference of the health impact? Then it could be one of 3 possibilities. Negligible difference, significant difference with the more artisanal products being a lot better for us, or perhaps a counterintuitive result that the more cleaner artisanal wines are worse for us because they have more heebie-jeebie stuff in them, like mycotoxins of various kinds, that actually, even though we feel lighter and better drinking these wines, in the long run actually do more harm than the slightly less clean Catena Malbec, let alone the supermarket plonk, which is infinitely worse. I mean, the Catena will probably be closer to the beautiful artisanal Burgundy, even though the gap between the two is big. What are the answers there? We need those answers too to answer this question. Enough. Lots of love. Thank you for being with me.